Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. So welcome everybody. We're back in virtual studio with Professor Steve Keen, and we have a surprise guest tonight. Surprise to Steve, but we've got Scott Heftler here. Scott is a Ph.D. philosopher from the University of Texas, and a friend and a colleague. And so I'm very happy to have him in studio along with Steve. A couple of the things that we're going to be talking about today or this evening are particularly the IPCC report. And Steve, have you had a chance to gloss over the report?
Yeah, I mean, I've read the policymakers summary for policymakers, and it's basically material that I've been reading the original papers on for the last 3 years. So. A fairly comprehensive summary of largely the temperature-related and precipitation-related effects of climate change. Not a lot on biodiversity in the summary for policymakers, but fundamentally material I've been reading. It's a vacuum cleaner, the IPCC, and then it filters it, and what gets filtered out is stuff that every government agrees to. So if you've been reading the original papers, as I have, this is a fairly mild statement of what can be expected.
Yeah, that's actually a great lead in here. 195 countries that have all signed up as member countries, and there's a good consensus in this. I know in the the climate change denial conversations that I particularly trying to avoid and have for quite a while. It's interesting to point out that even the countries that have a lot of I guess, incentive to continue with a status quo, business as usual mentality. They're member states, and first
they've got to sign off on it. And it's more. I don't even blame the countries on this front. It's just the fact that you have to get stuff which every scientist agrees to, and of course that's necessarily going to give you the lowest possible range. In terms of expected temperature effect and so on, but they try to do it by summarizing whether it's high agreement or low agreement, and what's had tended to happen over time is because the data continues confirming the results of the impact of retaining CO2 on global temperature and the effect on precipitation as well. Then they've been getting stronger. They've been going from likely to highly likely to almost certain, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, if anything, that's the real change between this summary document and the one from 2014. Some of the emphases are just more emphatic.
Yeah, stronger language, definitely got that. So I want to bring Scott into the conversation here, and this drill down of consensus or the concept of consensus is a low common denominator, and how much of it gets watered down, and this is the danger. We don't want it to be watered down. I think Scott's field is very, very much used to. I say getting consensus among philosophers is like herding cats. So, do you want to comment on that, Scott, at all about your field, and then also anything that you want to add about the report?
Oh, I have no idea what's going on with the report. I'm just here to learn from you guys, and I'm reviewing this Keen's great discovery that the use value of the machinery in the production process overturns the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. That seems, but that's not today's topic. So you guys carry on with
that.
That
is a different topic indeed. Yeah, yeah. Marxist philosophy and economics. Yeah, well. Happy to come back to that some other day, but I think if Dan wants to keep this on the IPCC, we'll have to use what Marx wrote in 1857 to some other day.
Good.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So okay. So keeping on the topic of IPCC, I'd like to spend a little bit of time here comparing some countries, and I made a few notes kind of coming into this episode. I wanted to compare Australia with Canada, for example. Okay, so we're looking at two countries that 20 million approximately versus 30 million in terms of population. In a list of countries by oil consumption, we have Canada as number 8 and Australia as number 20. Oddly enough, and this was the interesting thing about Australia, they had the highest median wealth at $191,000 US. What was another stat that I looked at here? $28,900 in terms of purchase power parity. You're aware of that. Is the PPP is? I think it's a variation. Is it used in economics as a variation to GDP?
Yeah, purchasing price parity. What it just means is you try to adjust for changes in the value of the currency relative to the American dollar. And what you get, of course, is a lot of volatility in the PPP measures, because your economy can remain at the same scale and your currency can fall 20%. So your purchasing price parity falls by the currency change. So I tend to ignore PPP calculation. I find them, it's just what it's giving you is the volatility of international exchange rates.
Oh, okay. And now, isn't there also something impregnated in the purchasing power that still is coupled directly to a GDP consumption production?
Oh, yeah. It's just an exchange rate revision of GDP measure. That's all it is.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Okay. So moving along, there's several countries here. This is just a Wikipedia graph that I'm not showing it, but it's some data that I looked up, and it was oil by country, and there's a ranking with Venezuela at the top. Now, I had to do a little bit of, some assumptions in terms of how they calculated the oil by country, because there's several factors in terms of reserves, productions per day, or production of barrels per day, consumption, exports, and imports, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, off the top of your head, is there a quick way to figure out who's on top with that? Is it simply
the overall thing is who can produce oil the most cheaply? Okay. Whose oil resources are the cheapest to exploit in energy terms? That's always going to be Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
I'm not particularly interested. The oil, when people once said the Stone Age didn't end for the lack of stones, and the oil age won't end for lack of oil, it's how expensive it is to get it out of the ground, and whether you have alternative means of applying energy. That oil used to be the vehicle for that energy, and from what I can tell, we'll be shutting down oil consumption a long time before we start hitting the physical limits of getting the oil out of the ground.
Okay, well then that's good news then, I guess, if we're going to be shutting.
No, because we're forced to by climatic changes. We've got to stop doing this. That's more what I expect to happen than suddenly finding we run out of the physical capacity to get the oil out of the ground.
Yeah,
and like the Saudis can still, when the oil price is above $12 a barrel, the Saudis can still get oil out of their major oil field and cost less than 12 to do it. Whether the energy input versus energy output, you're putting in less energy than you're getting out, so you're still getting a positive energy return. But the danger is, I'd actually rather get Simon Marchow on this front at some point, because he's done this work in detail. This is an Australian mining engineer now working in Finland and being given quite free rein to analyse the physical constraints by the Finnish government in a way he never got from Australia. In fact, he was hounded out of the country for talking about the unsustainability of Australia's minerals industry. So he knows this stuff, I think, far better than I do. So I'd rather have him for that conversation. What I'm actually interested in talking about is a set of papers which have come out just after the IPCC report by economists, saying what a great idea it would be to shut down the what's called AMOC. The acronym AMOC, Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and the tipping points. So economists having been criticised for not including tipping points in their models. They finally put out a paper that shows the impact of tipping points. And this is another paper that, to me, my attitude is, if we could drop a large rock on every economics department on the planet, the world would be a better place. Because these guys have come out and said that the impact of including tipping points is to reduce GDP by about 1% over what would happen in the absence of tipping points. And I'm just flabbergasted that this stuff has come out. Not so much that it does, because this is the sort of shit that economists pump out all the time. It's one of the names associated with it, somebody that I previously thought was somebody who did reasonable work within the mainstream envelope. And I'm afraid he's just joined the lunatics, the lunatics running the asylum, by helping conclude that it would actually be beneficial for human welfare if the AMOC shut down.
So is there some new news that came across your desk in the last week? Because
it's a new paper. It's put out by so look at the names here and see it's by Dietz, Rising, Sturck, and Wagner. It's called Economic Impacts of Tipping Points in the Climate System. And this looks like, I criticise them for saying they don't incorporate tipping points into their models. And they've now incorporated tipping points into their models. So I should be delighted, shouldn't I? Only how have they done it? And they've taken previous studies by economists and added in tipping point components to that. But the whole idea of a tipping point is you suddenly have a sharply either discontinuous or sharp change in the trajectory of your climate. So you suddenly go from 3 degrees Celsius to 6, that sort of thing. Or you have a dramatic increase in the energy being retained by the biosphere from the sun. With like the classic there being, if we lose the Arctic summer sea ice, then we add effectively the equivalent of 40 years of carbon dioxide over that event, because you flip from the Arctic reflecting 90% of energy it receives to absorbing 90% of energy it receives. So that's a rapid change. And if you wanted to simulate that in terms of carbon dioxide, it's like whacking, if it happens, say, over a 10-year period, which is what looks quite feasible, then that is like having a 10-year period where the rate of change of carbon dioxide is 4 times what it was the previous period. So you should see, if you're going to be plotting that on a chart, you're going to see a leap. Okay. Well, how have they done it? They've done it by fitting it to what they call a second-order polynomial, otherwise known as fucking x squared. Okay, which is a smooth function, and they're.
But isn't that their job? I guess I have a cynical view of economists. Aren't they like politicians? They know that eventually they might get hired on to be apologists for the people that would pay them and fund them. So of course
believe this garbage. They believe this garbage, Scott.
They're not minimizing it in order to get on board with Rand Corporation to write apology papers.
No, they sincerely believe this garbage. And this is why they're so fucking dangerous. Like I've really had it with them with this particular paper. Put it this way. Do you think, I'm going to be put a bad spin on Muslims here, so my apologies in the front is just for the sake of an analogy. But do you think if a guy, well, actually, let's take a white supremacist racing into a mosque to shoot people, like what happened in New Zealand in Christchurch about 2 or 3 years ago. Okay, do you think one of the Muslims could stand up and say, "Look, I'll give you $100,000. Don't shoot me"? No, he'd shoot you and take the 100,000. Okay, you cannot convince somebody who believes something sincerely to say it for money. And they're far more dangerous if they believe it than if they're doing it because they're self-interested. Frankly, and I hate to say this, it's ridiculous, but it's at the same time true, mainstream economists are amongst the most altruistic people I've ever met. altruistic in the sense that they're doing it because they believe it's good for everybody. Now, they're fundamentally wrong about it being good for everybody, but that's what motivates them. They think they have a model of a perfect world or how to make the world better, and that's their role, to make the world better.
I didn't know that. I thought that they were just like politicians.
No, anything back.
Officially, the job of the politician is the public welfare, to maximize. But the real interest is what Bob Kane calls mafia ethics. They're there to enrich themselves and their families, and that's it. They're there to receive as many gifts from lobbyists as possible. And you would think, surely economists are like highly educated politicians. Their job is to provide false data with great statistics, great p-values, convincing rhetoricians.
They're highly paid. They're highly skilled religious fundamentalists. Okay, you're funding mosques in that sense that are undermining capitalism in the belief they're making it a better system. So if your interpretation is you can pay them to change their minds, no, you're completely wrong. What happens is the ones who say the stuff that is most suitable to the power structure get more funding than those that don't. So they get the research funding they want, and yes, they'll get positions at higher rank universities. So if you're a complete neoclassical believer, you'll get a job at Yale or Princeton. Okay, if you're a critic, you'll get a job at Utah or Missouri. Okay, and there is a selection process going, so it does have an impact on income in that sense. But they're not saying it because they're being paid to say it. They fundamentally believe they understand how capitalism works, and their role is to make capitalism work better by getting rid of all the stuff that makes it work badly. And all that stuff is basically government intervention, and in this particular case, anything to attenuate climate change.
But what are the surrounding conditions that led to those particular professors having that high rank and creating the consensus or the canonical view? That's another thing that happened.
They got through first year economics believing it told them the truth. That's the qualifying. I mean, I did economics as my undergraduate degree in arts and law at Sydney University, and I was invited to be in the honours group. I dropped out of the honours course in the first term of second year after topping it. Okay. And I topped it because it was just mathematics. So it was easy for me to pass here's an exercise, solve this set of equations. That was a breeze for me. That's why I stuck in the honours course, because I knew I'd get a higher mark than if I dropped back to the pass degree, because I was sick of this shit. But the people who believe it went on and got their PhDs at Yale and Harvard, not from Sydney University in my particular year, but they get it because they believe it, and they can reproduce and enhance the belief system. It's got nothing to do with being motivated by the money.
But if there's a technical or a factual point, here they're using the wrong mathematical formalism. They're using this X squared function. They're taking tipping point data and really minimizing and flattening it inside this other formalism. Well, that's a technical point. So what about peer review? I mean, certainly there are facts of the matter in peer review, and it's not just consensus or dominant opinions.
Yes, it is. You have, if there was a study, I mean, climate change is a trivial issue according to most economists, okay? Unimportant, okay? The reason it's unimportant is because they believe capitalism can cope with anything, because their model of capitalism can cope with anything. If you draw two lines on a graph, and then you draw a third line, then the equilibrium moves from the first intersection to the second intersection. Easy. And they literally have this vision that their model is the real world. Okay, they've swallowed the belief their model is the real world. So they talk about the incredible flexibility of human societies, which is a sort of flowery way of saying a rapid transition from one equilibrium to another in our models of the economy. And they get rewarded in terms of a religious belief system for finding better ways of proving that God exists. Their God being equilibrium, their God being the marketplace. And if you read the early 19th century neoclassicals, people like Valrao, Jevons, Marshall, and so on, they will talk about equilibrium being a temporary crutch because we can't do dynamics properly. Okay? Now, when you get to the 20th century, equilibrium becomes a defining characteristic of capitalism.
Interesting.
Okay, and that shift, they're not, the modern neoclassicals even aren't even aware that's happened. They
right.
don't
So these lucky post hoc adjustments that capitalism introduced to maintain crises became integrated as like a feature of nature or like a feature of the model.
Yeah. And they really, so what they've done is equilibrium in their models means equilibrium in the real world, and what they reward is people who hang on to this equilibrium vision. Now, when the limits to growth turned up, and this is literally from conversations with Randers, who's one of the authors of Limits to Growth. Okay? Now, the Limits to Growth is written by engineers at MIT. It's people who don't know think it must be written by a bunch of hippies in San Francisco during the Hyde-Ashbury phase. No, it was done by bloody engineers, some of the greatest engineers on the planet, as it happens, including Jay Forrester, who really ranks as one of the great engineers of all time. They developed the model, and they thought that what it did was free economists from having to think in equilibrium terms. And Randers said they expected economists to adopt the technology and be very pleased that they'd finally been freed from thinking in equilibrium terms. Instead, the economists attacked them for breaking away from equilibrium and disparaged the technology using equilibrium methods, which are completely irrelevant in a dynamic model. If you see, William Nordhaus played the major role in doing that. He wrote a paper called, what's that particular first one called? Measurement Without Data, which is an absolute joke, because when you look at what Nordhaus himself did, he made his own bloody numbers up. This is what they've done. But it isn't that they're being paid to say this stuff. They genuinely believe it. It's in the same sense. I mean, I don't know what religion you are, but I know a lot of people who believe that a virgin gave birth to a bloke in the Middle East who ended up resurrecting and sitting at the right hand of God.
Right. Okay? I'm saying they believe that, but not in a cynical, cheap way where they're self-conscious of it. I think that they've aligned their interests.
They believe it totally.
Well, they do, because their livelihoods are enhanced. So you have to tell a lie well, you have to believe it sincerely. So just like religious people eventually graft themselves onto something that's originally alien and strange in order to gain what? Support, belonging, esteem, status.
Oh yeah, that's definitely true. I mean,
so these are strong, like pre-conscious motivators that would take what could have been a value-neutral, data-oriented social scientist to make him into an unconsciously aligned apologist, not a cynically aligned one.
That's true. That's true. That I agree with. And that's like I'm having experienced this inside economics departments for the last, certainly 40 years of my life, and I've saw it 15 right from being an undergraduate student back in 1971. There is a real sense of community amongst these people. Okay? And me being one of the ones who says, you guys are lunatics, we have a heretic community as well. So there's an orthodox and a heretic community inside economics. And the orthodoxies, when they see us walk past, you can just see the snide remarks of, that lot's here again, And the reason I would get rolled out as somebody to take on people who were disputing that economics actually was a problem was because I'd done mathematics to a moderately high level. I did first-year university mathematics when I was a critic in first year. And then I've done an honours degree in mathematics while doing my Ph.D. later. And now I've got mathematicians working with me as well. And so that's why I get rolled out as a sort of attack person on this stuff.
That's good. That's a good thing to have. That's like the ultimate trump card. If you have facility in mathematics, that should trump everything else.
It does. And I remember one neoclassical having a go at me, and one of my mathematical colleagues, a guy who ran the deputy director of the Fields Institute, which is the leading applied mathematics center in the world in Toronto. And this guy was having a go at my mathematics, and Matthias wrote back, mention one aspect in debunking economics where the maths is wrong. I didn't hear another word from that person, because they were happy to go at me. But if a genuine mathematician, whose Matthias's PhD was in quantum chaos, okay? They weren't about to, they're not so stupid that they'll take on somebody like Matthias. I'd rather have a go at me and say I got my mathematics wrong. When Matthias defends me, crickets. But there's a strong sense of community, and you're dead right about that. So it's a self-reinforcing community, and your status in that community comes out of whether you can push the envelope while not breaking it. Okay.
Let me bring up something here because I want to fill Scott in on one aspect. I'm not sure if he's aware, but you submitted the paper. It's not the Royal Society; it's a division of the Royal Society. I believe
called Proceedings to the Royal Society.
Right, and part of the research that buttressed your argument had to do with a software called Minsky that you've been developing for a number of years.
No. Minsky was. I've built a version of DICE in differential equations. That's what I've done. But the paper itself is just going through the economic literature and showing how utterly fallacious it is. But I mean, the question Scott's asking fundamentally is, why do they do this stuff? And the reason is because their model. If you want to go back to deep into the history. The classical school of economics preceded the neoclassical school. And when the classical school was in the hands of Smith and Ricardo, it was pro-capitalist and anti-feudal. When it turned up in the hands of Marx, he made it anti-capitalist. The whole idea that labour was the only source of value, which is something which derived out of the Adam Smith and Ricardo labour theory of value. Marx then turned that into saying, first of all, and this is our early conversation point, first of all, that labour is the source of all value, and secondly, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So when that turns up, what was the previous defensive ideology for capitalism is now a critical ideology. And very rapidly in the 1870s, there was a complete change of status. So the school of thought, what we now call the neoclassical school, which has a subjective theory of value, that was excluded from the academy fundamentally, from 1800 through to 1870. And then 1870, bang, suddenly they were the ones who were taken seriously. So there is definitely a sort of being, not so much being paid to say what you want, the capitalists want you to hear, but now that the people like this are saying it, you want them to become professors, so you will endow their school, their chair at a particular school. And Bitchan and I get their names mixed up in Toronto. The people who work in capitalist power, but they point out that Rockefeller endowed the Baptist University of Chicago, which became the home of Milton Friedman, and said the money he endowed to establish that unit was the best investment he ever made. So in that sense, there is the sort of purchasing you're talking about. But what it does is says a bunch of people have a fundamental, deep-held belief about the nature of capitalism, then become the people who become the professors. And that flip from classical to neoclassical, that's the last time there was a major change in the foundations of economics. So the money did play a role there.
So the response to the Marxist version of the labor theory, which is like a normative critical response, that was a crisis, and the response was to redefine it as in the subjective basis.
Yeah, I know the trouble with this. And thing is, when you look at it, I mean, when you look at this is in an abstract sense and leaving out the physics. If you start with the physics, you've got to have an objective theory of value. There's no such thing as a subjective law of thermodynamics. There's an objective theory. However, if you leave that side out of it, then the idea that value comes from effort, which is fundamentally the classical school of thought. The Marx and Smith and Ricardo all have a sense in which the effort required to do something is what determines its value. If you come to the subjective satisfaction of the consumer, that's a completely different foundation, which is the neoclassical. And ipso facto, there's no, leaving out the laws of thermodynamics, which I think clarify everything, but leaving that out, there's no simple reason why you'd say, well, one has got to be better than another. So somebody starts from a subjective theory of value and you're trying to argue an effort, you're talking past each other, ships in the night, okay?
That's right. But that's a smart move. Anytime you move anything into the subjective realm, that gives everyone more freedom to invent new hypotheses.
Trouble is when you try to make the subjective mathematical. Okay. Now that's where the neoclassicals fell over, because they wanted to have a subjective theory of value with a mathematical core, and that meant they had to find ways of adding up subjective things. And that's where they got caught in all sorts of dilemmas, because for a start, what they can show is using subjective logic, they can argue that there's a utility you might derive out of different combinations of different goods. So coffee and cheese, you've got these two goods, and different combinations of coffee and cheese will give you the same subjective utility. Okay? And then from that, they can derive a set of what they call preference, they call them indifference curves, but curves that state your preferences for these two commodities.
I see.
Okay, and then you can impose a price, which is given by the market, and you can impose an income, which is given by the market as well for this particular individual, and you can derive a demand curve for that individual. Okay, all nice and straightforward. That's what they teach in first year. Then they jump over to the market demand curve, which has exactly the same characteristics, downward sloping. But some mathematical economists decided to examine, well, under what conditions is that true? That the sum of individual demand curves has the same characteristics as a single individual demand curve. And one essential element of deriving the downward sloping curve for a single individual was that the changing the relative price does not change the income of the individual. Now, if I imagine you, Scott, you drink coffee?
Yes.
You eat cheese?
Yeah, of course. Okay. Yeah, I love cheese.
You've got an income?
Yes.
Well, it's highly unlikely that if I change the price of coffee relative to the price of cheese, that it would affect your income. Okay? So I can treat your income as fixed when I vary the relative prices. And that's what they do when they derive the demand curve for the individual in the textbooks. But with these mathematical economists, I'm talking top-class neoclassicals here, decided to say, well, let's generalize this and say, under what conditions will the aggregate have the same downward sloping effect? And when you have everybody, to have a market demand curve, you must include everybody in the market. And the market will include coffee producers and cheese producers. And when I change the relative price of coffee and cheese, I must change their income. Okay? So that was the dilemma they faced. And now the income is now a variable in the system. Now then they worked out under what conditions would the demand curve you get from aggregating all these have the same characteristics as the individual. And those conditions were that the relative consumption rates of each individual did not change as the income rose. So if you happen to, I'll use toilet paper and pizzas.
Well, yeah, my earning more, is it going to motivate me to buy more stuff?
But yeah, well, no, but you're going to buy more stuff in exactly the same proportion. The only way it would work is if I gave you 1,000 times your current income, you would therefore consume, roughly speaking, 1,000 times as much coffee and 1,000 times as much cheese. Now, I sort of think you might consume more Lamborghinis, which aren't even in your consumption set right now. But the only way they could do it was to show that increasing income did not change your expenditure. And the first guy to discover this, he actually discovered in the year of my birth, 1953, a guy called Gorman. He wrote something to the effect of, the necessary condition explained above is intuitively reasonable. It says that an extra dollar of income will be spent in the same way no matter to whom it is given.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I've always thought about this. There are things that will hold for individual situations, but that's not what a science is. A science needs to work with aggregates, laws, and universals. Yeah. So you amplify these things to universals, and they become ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's what they've done. They've tried to extrapolate from the individual the results they worked out, because they're working with a subjective theory of value. Everything works with a single individual. As soon as you have more than one, it falls over. Now,
I see. So to summarize what you're saying, once upon a time they had an objective theory that was tied to objective facts like the labor theory of value. Then there was this crisis. Then they redefined it subjectively. But in order for that to work, they had to do these summations, and the summations made poisoned the model.
Yeah, exactly. But the one thing, rather than saying, "Oh dear, we have to change it," they said, "Let's just assume that everybody's the same." And you get this crazy stuff turning up in the literature. So, for example, one of the many Nobel Prize winners is a guy called Gerard Debreu. He wrote a book called Theory of Value. Now, I recommend if you're actually physically at a university library, go and get a copy of Gerard Debreu's Theory of Value. out of the library and have a read. Forget about the math, just read over the mathematics because it's all in the text as well. At one point, he goes from a world in which you have certainty. Now, in certainty, what that means is you know, and this is a quote, the producer knows what combinations of goods will be necessary to produce some product in the distant future, though he may not know the technology involved. And you therefore sit down at one moment in time, and as a producer, you buy every input you're ever going to need for the infinite future, okay? And then he goes on, well, that's with certainty. Let's handle, obviously we know there's uncertainty. So he defines what he calls contingent commodities. And this goes from, you don't buy an umbrella. You buy an insurance contract that will deliver an umbrella on the 23rd of September in Toronto if it's raining. Okay, contingent commodities, that's what they call them. And he then says, and this is also pretty close to a quote, this develops a theory of uncertainty free of any probability terms and fundamentally, he says, I've got the exact wording, but it's something like free of probability concepts and formally identical to the theory of certainty worked out in the future chapters.
I see. So he shifted the uncertainty from the whole situation to the particular fact of needing the umbrella. Now it's like he's disguised it behind the variable.
Yeah, and then they do this all the time. He got a Nobel Prize for that fucking book. Okay, I reckon he should have been put in a padded cell for the writing the book. So what you get is it is not he's being paid to do this. He gets rewarded for it after the event. But what he's doing is maintaining the paradigm. And they maintain the paradigm by making assumptions that any sane person is going to say, this is crazy. If you say uncertainty is formally identical to certainty, then you haven't got uncertainty. Okay? But they define it out of existence. So that's your real danger. And when people do that, ultimately, they can walk into something like climate change and treat it the same way. So what they've done with climate change is say, well, by definition, capitalism can cope with anything. Therefore, climate change can't be serious. So let's go and prove that. And what horrifies me about this particular paper is that I'll read a particular quote of tipping points reduce global consumption per capita by about 1% upon 3 degrees Celsius, which is 5 degrees Fahrenheit warming, and by about 1.4% upon 6 degrees Celsius warming, based on a second-order polynomial fit of the data. Okay. Now, first of all, they're using a smooth function for climate temperature, which is what sort of absurd stuff we'll end up doing. But 6 degrees, the scientists have told us, it's 6 degrees, it's goodbye West Antarctic ice shelf, goodbye Greenland, obviously goodbye the Arctic. The AMOC is gone. I don't know whether you get an increased or decreased El Nino, but a completely different climate, utterly different. And they are telling us that an utterly different climate would reduce GDP by 1.4% compared to a world in which we still had Greenland, we still had West Antarctic, Arctic was still there, AMOC still existed. That is garbage. This is insane. Okay, truly
well,
insane.
It just goes to show you that our ideology can find its way into what you would think would be highly reviewed and tested, like the world of objectivity and model building. Like ideology can make its way into model building.
Yeah, and the reason is people are reviewing this stuff are people who've been previously vetted to review it by people who've published the stuff the first time around. So when Nordhaus, when he attacked Forrester for the predecessor to the Limits to Growth, what's called the World Model book, I think he saw this as a nice little learner. Like I know some of my colleagues who are doing the academic game. They're trying to get higher and higher. I just wrote work that I was interested in. I wasn't trying to climb the hierarchy. That was an accidental side effect of my career. But one of them, I remember once telling me he decided to publish everything Keynes ever wrote. He said, thought I had a great little learner here, didn't I? Thought this was going to be a great little... The bastard wrote so much, you get overwhelmed by the process. Now, so that was my good mate's experience in deciding to write the complete works of Keynes. I think Nordhaus looked at it, this is a niche I can specialize in, and I might, become famous, which he did. It worked very, very well. He ended up writing, he became the co-author of the textbook, Samuelson's textbook, which is, that defined economics back in 1946. So, and ended up getting a Nobel Prize for it. But he thought, oh, this is a nice way to publish lots of papers. Well, by 1991, he was virtually the only economist, well, not quite, but one of the very few doing it. And in his 1991 paper, he first attempted to quantify what the impact of climate change would be. Okay. But he said his hunch was that at 3 degrees would cause no more than a 2% fall in GDP. And his estimate was a 0.25% fall in GDP for a 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. And from then on, having got that stuff through referees himself, he would then be the go-to person for refereeing. And then somebody else gets it. Well, ultimately, in terms of how many papers have been published on this, it's a trivial issue for them. Stern and another guy went through doing a literature review and found that in the top 9 journals, I think, out of 77,000 papers over the last 50 years, I think 59 of them were on climate change. So there's only a tiny handful of people doing this, and you get this little cabal of self-reinforcing community where if you come out with the low estimate, that's cool, good on you, you know? You come out with a bad estimate, the door's
That's right, that's right. They're highly credentialed public relations ambassadors for big business, capital, petroleum industries, anyone who would suffer.
No, they're accidental ambassadors, okay? They are ambassadors for capitalism, their vision of capitalism. They're not doing it because they're being paid for it. It's society. I mean, Bjorn Lomborg has clearly been doing. I mean, have Bjorn Lomborg been paid for it? Yeah, total agreement. Richard Toll, the lunatic, believes this stuff. Nordhaus, the same story. Mendelssohn. I know some of these personally. One of them I do know personally. Very, very nice guy. I have a hard time being critical of Camillard, as it happens, because he's a nice human being. But they actually believe this stuff.
We said
they're doing serious science.
Yeah, isn't it hard to distinguish between someone who believes something because of thoroughgoing conviction and research versus someone who believes something in order to reduce cognitive dissonance with their own ethical qualms they might have with it before they realize how their careers benefited?
No, I don't. I think it is at the deep. I mean, when I think about what humans are as a species, one of the fundamental things is we share beliefs. Okay, I imagine dolphins are capable of it, and a few other species, but we can share beliefs. And that means we can work as a collective in a way that other species can't do. You would never have seen 50,000 lions deciding to go and attack another group of 50,000 lions. There's numerous instances of 50,000 humans doing that and losing their lives in the process of doing it. You can't say, the soldier at the front of the phalanx is doing it for self-interest. Mm-hmm. It's a shared belief system. So in that sense, what we have with science is a belief system which is countered by an analytic process, would work like a polarized filter to some degree. And that scientific process began with Galileo, showing when the beliefs contradict the physical world, then you start getting some dissonance. And science was a process of handling that dissonance. Economists, because you can't do experiments in economics, right. That dissonance isn't maintained. It happens for a short while during a crisis, and then it's back to relieving the religion.
That's right, and the crisis is always overcome more or less, no matter how insane the cure is, like the debt system and the credit system in the U.S.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
no matter how insane. I mean, 50 years ago, if someone saw that the householder debt was 10 times the national debt, the diagnosis would be the prognosis would be failure. But now it's something that's minimized, ignored, or marginalized, and I guess there is no crisis that would make its way into economic theory as fatal. It's impossible.
Yeah, and even when they do have something which is looks like it should be fatal, the 2010 crisis, they rapidly try to redefine it in such a way that they can cope with it. One of my favorite, another paper you take a look at by a guy called Ireland, fairly easy to remember. He's actually at Boston University. And he wrote a paper in 2010 looking at the financial crisis through the lens of neoclassical macroeconomic models of the time, and they're called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. And he said initially, this looks like we need to throw our whole theory out. But he then said, we can actually make it fit the data by having shocks to the system which get larger and last longer over time. Now, this is the whole idea of this, is that it's a system which will tend to equilibrium unless disturbed by exogenous shocks. And there are two types of shocks: shocks to taste and shocks to technology. And that's what causes all the fluctuations. And he said, oh, well, the shocks got bigger and lasted for longer, but they're all negative. And if you've got a normal distribution and the shocks got bigger, be positive and negative. Oh, no, these are all negative shocks. That's okay, you know. And they're willing to do that to make the model sort of fit the data. Hit it with enough negative exogenous shocks and it'll go down and then come back up again. So there's this desire to reframe it within the paradigm, always comes back again. To say the paradigm has failed, only a tiny minority are capable of that intellectually, and some have, but most of them, it's restore the paradigm.
And what you're saying right now, it reminds me of, well, what you're saying right now, it's almost like they're adopting an organic metaphor. They're saying we don't understand it, but capitalism has some intrinsic biological, natural, and innate homeostatic powers. And no matter how bad the crisis is, these as of now inexplicable powers will come to the rescue and save the system. And this reminds me of, like, I guess in the early 90s, I took a Marxian economics class, and they were talking about how Citibank had hired these chaos mathematicians and stuff in order to provide like another way to absorb and normalize a crisis. And these people were hired on board purposely in order to say, well, look, these chaos graphs show that it's natural for any system to invite chaos, breakdown, and crisis, and then this will help it reconstitute on a higher level. And I think that's what they were trying to say, is that there's some unknown self-saving homeostatic power that capitalism has, and there's no crisis that will be fatal to it.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, it's become how they work in mathematical terms as well. I mean, one of the funny things for me, being somebody who does mathematical modeling, is how well they're willing to distort the rules of mathematics to stick with the idea that equilibrium is stable. So, for example, the dominant model these days, there's two dominant classes of model, what they call real business cycle models and dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. They're both built on the foundation of Ramsey's growth model from 1928, a mathematical prodigy called Ramsey. And Ramsey had an exercise where he said, is there an optimal savings rate for a society? Now, he using a very utilitarian mathematical system, he came down to saying there's two components, the capital level of consumption and the capital to labor ratio. You can ultimately get it down to a two-dimensional system. And a two-dimensional system can have several sorts of equilibria, but one of them is like, if you imagine, like if two-dimensional system, you can describe like a bowl, for example. So if you throw a ball bearing into a bowl, it'll ultimately get down to the bottom of the bowl. You can also have it upside down like a Vietnamese hat. You drop it on the hat, and no matter what you do, it's going to fall off the hat. The other possibility is a saddle. Okay, so it's stable. If you happen to be so lucky that you threw the ball bearing so that it rolled along the horse's spine, it would finally come to settle in the top. But of course, it's going to slide off either side. So a saddle is unstable, and that's the result they got. This model has an unstable equilibrium. Now their response was say, what that means is there has to be a jump variable, which can jump from wherever it might be in the overall phase space of per capita consumption versus capital.
Back to the top of the Mexican hat where there's that little stability dip.
Yeah, well, actually, back to the horse's saddle, jump onto that bit. So you might be somewhere here, you're miles off there's only one stable path to get to that saddle. And the bottom of the saddle is, say, in the year 25, I can take the old rock song. That's where the bliss point. You actually call it a bliss point. There's the bliss point. We're off it now in the year 2021. So consumption can instantly jump onto this line, which will get us to 25, and we'll reach that equilibrium point. And they happily do that. Now, a mathematician, when you have an unstable system, will say, you can't do that. You can't presume consumption to just instantly change like that. You've got a phase space, and if it's unstable, you'll be attracted towards it for a while because one of the dominant eigenvalues is negative, but the others is negative, but the other's positive. You're going to get driven away. And they make this into a mathematical, and it becomes incredibly complicated, really, really hard to work it out. And based on the idea that an unstable equilibrium is made stable by us all being rational. And the definition of rational is we know the future.
And also, well, what's making, I'm thinking maybe these economists are imagining that human beings are so plastic that what's required for the model to work can be indoctrinated through the right type of, the culture industry by producing desires, like marketing. With the power of marketing, you can artificially and on demand raise and increase savings rates, raise and increase consumption rates.
No, marketing has no effect. Your preferences are endogenous to you. Can't be varied by the outside system. They don't even take marketing into account. I mean, trust me, I've spent enough time. They laugh about marketing to a large degree. They think we already know our preferences. If you actually argue that the system could change your preferences, that would make preferences something affected by the macro system. And you could no longer have a defined set of preferences against which you set your budget. Okay?
I see. So preferences need to serve as an independent variable.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So they don't treat that at all. They leave marketing out of it completely. What they see, and if you think about what they would want to have found, Ramsey had to do a lot of mathematics to work out that equilibrium. Okay. And then he does what's called eigenstability analysis, eigenvalue analysis, and finds it's got an unstable equilibrium. Oh shit. Would have been better if it was stable, because then it was stable. No matter where you are, you'd reach the bliss point. Okay. So what happens so frequently is they get a result they don't want, and then they respond by bringing in some maneuver that means they can exploit what they don't want to get what they want. And what they wanted was the equilibrium is stable. Now, if you think about the market, the way the market's spoken about by Marx and Ricardo and even Walras and Jevons as well, it's something which takes unintelligent, uninformed people and produces a socially optimum outcome. And what they found was, to get the socially optimum outcome they wanted, we had to all be gods. And my whole point is, if you have to be God for the market to work, who needs the market? Okay. So rather than proving the essential role of the market in achieving collective intelligence, which is the way that Hayek talks about it, and in that sense, it's a sensible view of the market. The market takes the incomplete knowledge of millions and millions of people and works out some sort of form of collective knowledge. That they use this, the socialist calculation critique and so on. That is a sensible way of looking at a market as a useful mechanism in capitalism. But for neoclassicals, because they couldn't get the equilibrium, the market, the points they got were unstable. They're willing to say, well, let's just assume people have got this infinite processing power, and they can therefore work out the stable vector on this otherwise completely unstable phase space, and therefore reach the bliss point in the distant future. So it's pathetic, fundamentally. I find it quite pathetic in the sense that they get, fundamental challenges and say, let's assume a can opener.
So let me interrupt here. We're approaching we're approaching the top of the hour, and I believe, if I heard you correctly, Steve, you mentioned something about Jevons. Is that the same Jevons as the Jevons paradox?
Yep.
Okay, so why don't we wrap up with the Jevons paradox? Give us some insight about the Jevons paradox.
Well, the basic idea, if you have efficiency rather than meaning you use less of a resource, you're more likely to use more of it, fundamentally. If you find a more efficient way of using oil, rather than oil consumption falling, it'll increase. And that Jevons was actually a bit of a polymath. He was he was a geneticist. He was a racist in that sense, in the 19th century way. But he was also involved in the coal industry. He and Pareto I have a lot more time for than modern neoclassicals. There was some deep insights in Jevons. And the most useful one was that if we manage to be more efficient about something, rather than using less of it, we're more likely to use more. And that was a good insight.
Okay. Scott, do you have any final wrap-up questions? I always want to keep it, right to the hour. And anything you'd like to ask Steve? I think you might actually want to come back for another episode. There seems to be lots to talk about.
I need to chalk up a little bit on this stuff. I really need to chalk up. the criticisms of standard economics theory that I got from my friends that were taking classes, and they would come back from class baffled about this rational, like the ideal rational subject, the profit maximizing, was it utility maximizing subject, and he just thought all these equations are based on the assumption that people are rational utility maximizing agents, and he said, but I know of myself that I'm not that. And I thought, fascinating, and that's the only insight I ever got about economics until I took my Marxian economics class later. But I never took a micro class, never took a macro class. So I really love what you're saying. It's fascinating, and you know your material. I just need to talk up on my vocabulary, like equilibrium. Sure, I'm understanding what that is. But I'm going to have to go through my Oxford economics glossary so I can prepare.
Well, Steve, here's the thing. He just admitted he didn't take the micro and the macro. It's almost a good thing, I guess, if he didn't take the indoctrination.
But for the fun of it, I recommend, why don't you enroll or attend one of those undergraduate classes at your university and sit in and just say, I'm a philosopher. I want to see what you guys argue. And, don't necessarily interject. It's up to you. What do you do on that front? But you'll see where this stuff comes from. And I can give you a few little thought bombs to throw in about aggregation if you want to have a bit of fun disturbing the lecturer.
Good.
Right on, and we'll look at bringing Scott back once he's amassed some ammunition of some cannon fodder there.
Okay,
how does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks. Thanks again, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.